So let's talk about what was in that statement with Miata Fanbule, who is Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, a left-of-centre think tank, and Dr. Joan Harvey, who is a consumer psychologist at Newcastle University. Good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Miata, if I could start with you. Both of the costs of shutting down large parts of the economy and the cost of trying to rebuild it are almost incomprehensible, aren't they, compared to normal times? Now, the Chancellor says we're facing the biggest economic contraction for 300 years, and he's definitely got the data to back that up. In fact, it's the OBR saying that. Are you cheered is not the right word, but are you encouraged by what he is doing to mitigate the ramifications of what has happened?
I think it's a start, but I think we've got a long way to go. And for me, the big takeaway from this spending round was the Office for Budget Responsibility's figures and the scale of the economic hit. And that economic hit translates into people's livelihoods, their incomes, their jobs, and people are struggling in this country, and we're about to enter a really, really tough winter. And I don't feel like the Chancellor did enough on that front. So there was no mention, for example, of social security, despite the fact that we know that many people have lost their jobs, others have been excluded from government support scheme. And I would have wanted to see him doing more to bolster income for people. We talk about a minimum income guarantee of £227 a week. That would not only enable people to afford the basics to survive on, but it would also provide a much needed boost for the economy. And the second area I think he fell short was, we know we're going to have to create lots of jobs. And that requires the government to invest big fiscal stimulus, which is what we're seeing across Europe. We didn't see anything of that scale here. We've talked about 28 billion that could have gone into green infrastructure, creating 400,000 jobs in the next 18 months. They could have put 18 billion into care jobs, public health jobs. That would have created 700,000 jobs in the next 18 months, jobs we desperately need. And then you combine that with their restart program to train people and place them. So there were good things in there, but given the scale of the challenge, drop in the ocean.
Why are you ignoring the record infrastructure spending, though? Surely that will create tens of thousands of jobs, will it not? £100 billion next year?
So the infrastructure spending will do. I think the challenge for the infrastructure spending is a lot of it is spending that has been essentially repurposed from before the pandemic. So it's spending we were going to spend anyway. And now it doesn't mean that it's not a bad thing, but I would suggest that the scale of it isn't up to scratch. The second thing is just putting money into infrastructure spend doesn't necessarily yield economic returns straight away. So if you think about some of the investment that was being captured in there that will go into, say, rail or roads, for example, that takes 5 to 10 years to materialize. Whereas we actually need investment in stuff that can boost the economy now and critically create jobs now. And I think it's always a false economy when we focus too much on the hard stuff. For me, if you're going to spend on infrastructure, first and foremost, you need to make it green so that we're spending in a way that responds to the big challenge of climate change we have. But we should also be thinking about social infrastructure, the soft stuff that makes our communities and our society work. And that is, community infrastructure, that's about care workers, that's about public sector workers. And there wasn't enough from that. Just the big kit is not going to deliver what we need.
But the £4 billion Levelling Up Fund, which I know is kind of geographically specific, but that in itself will create, because that's a kind of micro infrastructure projects. He talked about them, didn't they? Kind of flyovers and cycle lanes, etc., that are very localised. Surely that in itself is something to be applauded and will provide jobs.
So definitely, I think the fact that there is a levelling up fund, I think is good news. I think it speaks to the government's intent to make this agenda critical. So I 100% support that. I think the challenge for the levelling up fund is that it is a massively centralised fund. It requires places to sort of go up to Whitehall, make their case and do, goodness knows what. If they were serious about trying to level up very quickly, you would push that funding down. You would devolve it to local areas so they could spend on their priorities. And some of it might not be the things that central government wants to spend, but it will be the things that unlock growth and improve living standards in their particular communities. So again, I think the intent is right. I think it's good that we've got a large sum. Now, I don't know what period that 4 billion is for. So if it's 4 billion over 5 years, that's just continuing the sort of spending that we have. Whereas if they're trying to bring forward that spending over a short period of time. That's kind of the type of boost that we need. But you've got to give local control so that in the end, the people that are closest to the problems on the ground are able to spend on their priorities to deal with those problems.
Do you think it unfair that at the time when the private sector wages are down by 1% and public sector wages have gone up by 4%, that he has announced a freeze on some public sector workers?
So I think the Chancellor's framing of pitting the private sector and the public sector against each other is wholly unhelpful and really divisive. And the truth is...
Is it accurate, though?
Well, no, because his 4% increase, I'm not sure where the data that supports that. But the critical thing is, it's not an either or. So on the one hand, some of our public sector workers are amongst the lowest paid workers. Take the social care sector as a starting point. And for me, they do absolutely vital work, and we should pay them properly, and we shouldn't apologise for paying them properly.
But hasn't he accounted for that? Pay rises for the lowest paid in the public sector will not be frozen. He made that clear in the budget, did he not? Sorry, not the budget, the public spending review.
Which takes me to my second point. So, of course, what we're seeing in the private sector is a pay squeeze. And actually, even with the increase in the minimum wage, what we're finding is even through things like the furlough scheme, people are being paid 80% of the living wage if they were on it, or the minimum wage if they were on it. So for me, the challenge is not let's basically bring the public sector down to the level of the private sector. We should be thinking about ways in which we actually push up wages within the private sector. And why that matters is if you have people's wages increasing, whether that's in the public sector or the private sector, they spend in their local economies. And that then enables the economy to start pump priming and growing again. And the way that we solve all of this is by getting our economy working. So it's not just that you're increasing wages, you're also increasing demand in the economy, and that's what we need to do.
So how would you increase wages in the private sector? You could give tax cuts, but certainly people are thinking that that's not going to happen. We can't give tax cuts out at a time like this, can we?
Well, so I think there are two phases. The first priority is that we have to protect jobs and create jobs, and you've got to support businesses in order to be able to do that. The ways that we have historically increased wages in the private sector is part legislation regulation, the minimum wage, the living wage being examples of that. But we also have to think about when, for example, we see a return to growth, an improvement in productivity. The lesson of the last 10 years is that not enough of that went to workers. So wages pretty much stagnated despite the economy growing over the last 10 years. Living standards did not budge. And for me, that requires intervention. We've got to try and skew things so that actually when we are doing well, the people who are, making that happen get a slice of the pie. And that's not been the case over the last 10 years. We can't afford to make that mistake again. And if we start off saying, let's bring everyone down, we start off with the wrong mindset in order to solve the problem that we need to.
But do we not also, Miata, need to make sure, as has been pointed out by a number of people, that we don't saddle future generations, my kids and their kids' generations, with this debt, which is growing exponentially?
It is a big number, so 400 billion. I would argue that the government probably didn't have any choice but to spend at those levels. The key question for me is, firstly, the number isn't what matters, it's our capacity to finance that. So at the same time as our deficit is at historical high levels, we also find that the cost of financing that deficit is at historical low levels because interest rates are pretty much flat and threaten to be negative. So actually, this is absolutely the right time to do that. The second thing I'd say is that the way in which we bring down the deficit in the years to come is by getting the economy working again. That's the story of the financial crisis. The countries that stimulated their economy, that essentially expanded output, increased tax takes, were the ones that were able to bring their deficit down. I think that's a far better strategy, combined with probably tax rises as well, than cutting. Because cutting and austerity, of which I would argue the public sector pay freeze is part of that, is short term. And we've learned from 10 years that it is also a flawed strategy.